Hi guys, this is Anna and welcome to my book review of two books actually by the same author. One which came out very recently and I've read last year, and one previously published by the same author I have reread last year just to refresh my mind so I can compare both of them. So if you have read them and you're interested, stay tuned. So in November last year I have finally picked up and read The Gene and Intimate History by Siddhartha Mukherjee. He is an American oncologist. He is also a research scientist. He's focusing obviously on cancer genetics, and he is of an Indian descent. So this is his second sort of popular fiction book, and it follows up from where he left with his Pulitzer Prize winner book, one Pulitzer book, I think in 2011, which I absolutely adored. This is The Emperor of All Maladies. So as I mentioned, I started reading The Gene back in November, finished it very early in December. I did like it, but I didn't fall in love with it. And I remember how much I loved his first book, so I went and reread The Emperor of Maladies in December. And I have been asked to do this review, but I kind of procrastinated, so I thought I'd better do it while it's still fresh in my mind. I'm not an active scientist, so I can't really criticize too much, but I do have a background in the medical genetics, and I have my PhD in molecular biology, and I studied Huntington disease afterwards as a research scientist. My master's was in cancer genetics, so I kind of do have a very solid background. So I think I know a little bit more than the lay audience for whom those books are directed, so it should be fairly okay for me to judge those books. Right, so The Gene. The Gene starts really in a similar line to The Emperor of All Maladies. So he actually tries to be down to earth, and he tries to make books and the subject matter more personal by giving you a little bit of the background of his family. So he's using his own family history to set the book, and he quite openly shares some of the very personal information about the mental health in his family, which I thought was a really brave decision to do, because he must have asked permission from his siblings and the remaining older relatives. Not every family would want their dirty laundry paraded in such a way. The book is divided into sections, so it walks you through the history of the modern genetics. It starts pretty much with a little bit of introduction of what happened before Gregory Mendel, and then walks you really nicely through the 19th century, through the early 20th century. It talks about the movement called eugenics in quite nice details. It gives you a little bit of a history of that and some of the most prominent cases, and clear abuse of the human rights, a little bit about Dr. Mengele and Auschwitz and his horrible experiments in human bodies. It doesn't actually mention much about what the Japanese did to the Manchurians, because they basically had a very similar system. A lot of what we know about boundaries or hypothermia when you get really cold comes from their torture of the prisoners of war. They would literally submerge them in the ice cold water and see how long they will last. But a lot of divers and submarine training is now based on it. And I had absolutely no problem with that, all the way up to more recent history. And I think his more recent, by recent I mean 2004 onwards, side of the book is lacking in detail. What I really liked about this is the way he writes. So his writing prose is really easy to follow. If you're not an expert in the field, you will find it super easy to just turn the pages. He tries to break the terminology down, so pretty much every single thing is defined for you at least once. He gives you excellent references. I think if you're an A-level student, or if you're very keen GCSE student, a reference list alone is fantastic, and I commend him for that. But as far as the modern techniques go, it's a bit short, and I don't know why. So I'll come back to this, because I can't talk about this book without talking about The Emperor of All Maladies, which I think is definitely the stronger of the two books. It's a little bit thicker, it clearly took him longer to write. He also based it on the same principle. I can see how this was an obvious sequel to the history of cancer. He is an oncologist, so this is his area of expertise. Not only his area of expertise, this is the area he loves and he studied in detail. And his love for the subject area just shines. I think that's what makes this book so wonderful, is that he clearly loves to talk about it. He loves what he does. And a lot of the stuff he discusses in The Emperor of Maladies, people need to know, because most people don't know much about the history of oncology. They don't understand where chemotherapy came from originally, they don't understand where radiotherapy came from. So this book starts in a very similar vein. So it goes back to the ancient Egypt and a little bit of what we knew. It talks about very early sort of medieval ways of dealing with cancer, 19th century dealings, and then obviously the majority of the book is 20th century, and he gives you a wonderful detailed account of the movements responsible for the way we look at cancer now. The way we look at cancer and fundraising for cancer research has changed dramatically since 1960s, and this is the most funded area in medicine. Working in Alzheimer's disease and Huntington before, I can only attest to that. The amount of charity money, the amount of government money which goes towards cancer is humongous if you compare it to any other research. And you can argue whether it's, well, if you judge by the most recent statistics in the UK, when I did my university degree in the 2000s, we've been told that 1 in 3 of us will die of cancer. Now it's 1 in 2. So we are living longer, therefore we're more likely to come across this disease. I absolutely love the section devoted to chemotherapy research and leukemia research in America. It reads as a thriller. Rereading this was just as wonderful experience as reading it back in 2011. Obviously, 7 years now passed by. The science has moved on, so it does leave you hanging with sort of more modern research. It doesn't really talk much about the gene therapy for cancer, but it gives you the basics, explains to you why we need to take cocktail medicine, why doing dramatic breast augmentations if you have breast cancer is not always good, and the difference in those surgeries, and how, particularly in America, the public onlook towards cancer has changed dramatically over the years. It's a wonderful book, and I can totally see how it took him at least 7 years to write. I can see how he came up with one idea and he worked on it at night while he was working in the hospital. I love the personal approach. I love the way he very nicely and gently brings his own experience with his own patients in. And because he kind of finished with the modern age, the most logical progression, as I mentioned before, was to go into the gene. But here, I find, and the book was rushed a little bit more, it wasn't a labor of love. This is like a child. This is the child you love. This is more like, I'm proud of my work, but I don't necessarily love it as much. I think maybe if he gave it another year or another 2 years, he could have worked on the more modern side better. Another thing which I really didn't like, and it struck me in The Emperor of Maladies, but here it was mentioned less than here, obviously. The guy is absolutely obsessed with James Watson. James Watson was one of the 3 people awarded the Nobel Prize for the discovery of DNA, and I don't really like him, not even as a person, even as a scientist. I think the guy got lucky. I don't think he's bloody amazing. And Siddhartha Mukherjee, he just sings him praises. And in this book, that was grating on me. That was really grating on me. The amount of pages devoted to things like epistasis was very, very small. Epigenetics pretty much got no mention. I think it's such a hot topic at the moment, and so many more people would love to know more and listen what the heck is epigenetics and how does it affect the genome, and how our lifestyle will have a dramatic impact on our genetics. And I think if that was explained better, the book would have been 5 out of 5 for me. But because it left me wanting more, it's still just a 4. Everything up to sort of 2000s is fantastic. But then again, it is easier to research because it's in the public domain more. You can read other books, you can look at them in more detail. The modern stuff is harder to catch up with because it's changing so much. The book came out in 2016, it's already different. It is already different because we're using modern techniques more. And some of the most modern techniques are not mentioned here. Like even the Gulf War, US Gulf War, which we have been using for what, 15 years now, it's not even modern, hardly gets a mention here when he talks about flies, fruit flies. But I commend him for talking about eugenics. I commend him for talking about the Drosophila research, because not that many people do, but I think C. elegans could have gotten a little bit more mention. I don't know. I would like the book to have an extra 100 pages and taking a little bit more time to read and to be a little bit more all-encompassing, but that's a personal preference, I suppose. Will I recommend people to read it? Absolutely. Who I think should read it? Anyone from the age of 14 onwards. It's a fantastic way to look at the history of the humankind, of the way we treat other people, of the way we understand ourselves. There's nothing horrible about this book, and it gives you such a chance to go and explore the topic in more detail. And when I was thinking of recording this video, I looked at my shelves in my personal library, and I've selected a couple of books which he heavily cites. I don't have the double helix because, as I mentioned, I don't like James Watson, so I deliberately don't have his book. But some of the other books which he really heavily mentions, starting with an absolute classic in science, this is Francois Jacob and the flies and mice and men. This is not a typo, this is actually the name. And they're talking about the lac operon discovery, the switching the genes on and off in different cells in different conditions, which is fundamental to the way the genes are expressed in the body and the cells get differentiated. And Francois Jacob, the lac operon and the discovery, that was such a fundamental discovery. It's a huge book which influenced researchers for years and years and years, and I think more people need to read it. Another one which came out, I think in 2000 and 2001, I purchased it when it came out. I was still doing my A-levels. This is Brian Sykes and the Seven Daughters of Eve. So this is the very, very easily written. Reads like Dan Brown in a way for some people. Introduction to mitochondrial DNA and the way you can study mitochondrial DNA to look at the ancestry and the way human migration happened from the Northeast Africa originally, where we all came from. Two books which have shifted the way we look at genetics, public looks at genetics, both are Matt Radley. One is The Red Queen, The Sex and the Evolution of Human Nature. It's an absolute classic now. It was a New York Notable Book of the Year, and I have a very old edition. Probably not as old as this one. This one has been traveling with me ever since my A-levels. This is his genome, the autobiography of species in 23 chapters, because we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, as you know. It's very cleverly done. This is something that all my A-level students read. It's an absolute basic. Another one from the same genre pretty much is Not in Our Genes, the Biology, Ideology and Human Nature. This goes a little bit more into psychology, so it links really nicely with his idea of eugenics. It's another gentle introduction on the matter. And then my absolute favorite, which I recommend to all my students, which has been recommended to me 17 years ago by my A-level teacher, and this is the eighth day of creation, Makers of Revolution in Biology, this expanded edition by Hans Freeland Johnson, and this is an amazing collection of interviews done with pretty much all of the key players in the sort of middle 20th century genetics. This is done by several journalists who had multiple interviews, they've taken multiple interviews with the likes of Watson and Crick, with the likes of Rosalind Franklin. They talked about what happened in the 70s, that was crossing over. It has basic diagrams. It has pictures of all the key players. It goes in more detail. It talks about Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in the 50s, because when James Watson won it, his Nobel Prize money, that's what he invested in. He invested in his institute. You can look at it, insulin, look at Sanger. Sanger Institute is named after Sanger. And in the history of the gene, which is an intimate history, Siddhartha Mukherjee, he does talk about a lot about how we discovered insulin. He talks about very early patterning law, how the pattern law changed. It gives you really nice introduction to how people used to fight in order to get the human genome. There was two competing, there was the government program versus the private program, and how they decided to come together. I knew everything in that book because I'm interested in the area, but if you know nothing, this would be great, but I would still recommend you start here. This is such a wonderful book. Oh my gosh, I rambled now for nearly half an hour. I hope you're not asleep. But as you can see, I like non-fiction. I like science non-fiction. So hopefully you will pick up and read the books. Thank you guys for watching.